Can y'all hear me all right? Okay. Thank you, Dewey, for that introduction. I made sure Dewey knew that I voted for him every time he was on the ballot before he did that. So, let's get started. Coiled TubingSpecialties is myself, my little brother Brad, and David Briscoe. And for about the last 7 years, we've been working to harness, if you will, the energy in radial hydraulic jetting and apply it to well completions, particularly horizontal completions. In doing that, we've amassed quite a profile of or portfolio of intellectual property. Right now we're prosecuting about 52 different IP actions literally all over the world. China, Australia, of course US and Canada. But I think probably the most valuable thing that we have is we have a modeling study from Dr. Michael Smith that gives us some insights as to what happens when you first jet a mini lateral well bore or borehole before you frac. You actually start entering into the realm of frac steering, if you will. Here's the outline with which I'd like to approach this. By the way, how many of you have driven down Highway 75 in Tulsa? You know, it's a big, nice divided highway. It's 6 lanes now in a lot of places in the city limits. So I'm driving down that highway last week, and my wife calls me on my cell phone, and she is absolutely frantic. She said, "Bruce, are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." She said, "Well, be alert and be careful out there." I said, "Honey, what's wrong?" She said, "They just had a news bulletin come across the television that some nut is driving the wrong way on Highway 75. I said, "Honey, there's more than one. There's hundreds of them out here." That's kind of what you feel like when you're introducing new technology into the oil and gas industry. Before we get going, I want us to have a common terminology. You see here in the center your horizontal well, and of course off to the right here is the vertical well bore, and you can see by the arrow the path of least resistance for your frac is going to hit it and maybe leave you with a condition like this when you pull or try to pull your rods and tubing. The dots there represent microseismic data. Think of miniature earthquakes, if you will. And it's not an exact one-to-one correspondence with where your frac fluid is, but it's a pretty good proxy. But I'm saying that our terminology is really a lot like football. You've got a strong side. Whoop, that's a wrong button. You've got a strong side where your pore pressures are higher, your rock fabric is stronger, you have higher fluid saturations and therefore higher remaining reserves. And due to the depletion of the vertical well, you've got weaker pore pressures, weaker rock fabrics, and that's why the path of least resistance is generally straight toward it. If you think about it also, the reason that horizontal lateral is laid north-south is because they anticipate their fracs are generally going to propagate east-west. Well, guess what? Yours probably did too when that vertical well was originally completed. So you're actually reaching out to them, if you will. But what happens? You know what happens. Probably the best thing that can happen is maybe you defer production. You hope you can get it all back. Maybe you haven't suffered a diminishment of reserves. You're going to have to spend money to clean your well out. If you got bashed hard, if you collapse casing, for example, and you have a one-well lease, now you're at risk of losing your lease. And if you're like me, when I was an independent and operated or had about 100 wells and operated 2/3 of them, I had every one of them mortgaged. So you got a long walk to the bank to tell them about this well. This is what we're proposing as the solution. We call it getting sideways squared. We got sideways once, right, when we started drilling horizontal wells. What we're saying is what we need to do before we frack is to drill mini laterals, small boreholes about 1.5 inches in diameter and up to 300 feet long, generally perpendicular to that main lateral, 90 degrees, before we frack. Because when you do that, instead of originating your frack from point sources or perforations in the lateral's casing, you're starting to originate your frack job from a line source within the reservoir. We call it fracking from the inside out. Here's my premise. What we've really accomplished in horizontal drilling today is this. We've become very efficient at stringing together a bunch of very ineffective frack jobs. It is like a factory out there, right? We're pumping down plugs and perforating guns, and we may be fracking one well next to us while we're perforating ours, and then we switch over, and that switch time is timed in just minutes. It's a continuous operation, and we got our light plant out there, and it's 24/7, and it's very efficient. But I submit to you the fracks that we're generally left with aren't very effective. Picture two strapping young engineers that begin their career in 1980. That's from my wedding, by the way, and that's Bob Nickel off to the right. But in 1980, we're dealing with reservoirs that you measure permeability in millidarcies. And this is George King's slide, and you see what he's indicating is how long of a frac wing length or half length you have to have a profitable well based on the rock's permeability. As the rock's getting tighter, you have to have longer and longer hydraulic fractures. I mean, technically, we really don't need horizontal wells. All we need to do is to be able to have wing lengths of about 1 mile or 2. Well, it's impossible to stay in zone that long. Now then, what I've done on that same plot is I've overlaid the permeabilities of most of the shale plays that we're in right now. The Eagle Ford maybe would classify as something close to conventional or near tight. Everything else, if you want to talk about permeabilities in this range, you've gone from millidarcies to microdarcies. If you get over here and want to talk about the Barnett, Woodford, and particularly the Haynesville, you've gone from microdarcies to nanodarcies. This is a logarithmic scale. A nanodarcy is 1/1,000,000th of a millidarcy. I mean, it's like we're almost trying to produce out of plate steel. Well, here's the problem. And the problem's not just of frac hits, but it's frac control. And I would submit to you that frac hits is a subset of this general problem. But we know well it's a directional problem. Here's a slide from NCS Multistage that I overlaid with my comments in yellow. Over to the right is what we intend to do with our fracs. We intend to create stimulated reservoir volume, or SRV, equally on both sides, so we can drain both sides of the reservoir. But over here on the left, Over here on the left, you see an actual well and fracs from each stage that have been tagged with RA tracers. And except for a couple of stages, everything went only one direction, right? So you're left in the boxes with the question marks of a serious problem of stranded reserves. If we look at our particular case, and in 3D, we've got our vertical well here that's been there for years and it's been producing, so it creates around it a zone of depletion or partial depletion. That rock fabric has become weaker, so when our horizontal well operator goes in and he starts to complete his well and he starts fracking at the toe and he creates a stimulated reservoir volume, an SRV, for the first stage, in the blue for the second stage, in the yellow for the third, and so on. But then he comes to this stage, and that frac lines out at that vertical wellbore. And it leaves, here in the dash box, all of those stranded reserves. Generally speaking, as far as just raw dollars, there's a lot more money left hanging out here than there was ruined here. Next, the problem of frac control is a dimensional problem. Well, let's back up one. If you look up here, up top, you have an aerial view of the multiple stages in fracking a Haynesville well. The dots represent microseismic data for each stage. A different color represents a different stage. And if you look closely at it, you see that stages 1, 2, 5, and 7 have no westward advancement at all. Everything goes east, right? And if you look at it down here, in a profile view, here's your wellbore, and you're going through the Haynesville layers A, B, and C. And look at all this microseismic activity up in the middle Bossier, even up into the upper Bossier. And we know this really happens because we've got Haynesville wells that actually produce Cotton Valley water from over 1,000 feet above. Also, if you look down here at the lower Haynesville layers, you got very little stimulation in those. Consequently, we know we're dealing with a dollars problem. If the cost to frac a horizontal well is typically 50 to 55% of the total well cost, how much money do you think we've pooped away up here in the Bossier? Also, how much money have we left on the table down here in the lower members of the Haynesville? Now, because of those stranded reserves, we're left with the question, do I have to drill another well to capture those reserves? If you follow me on LinkedIn, you saw this post. What's really fascinated me is that just within the last several months, within 2019, there's been like this epiphany that none of our horizontal wells, or few of them, are actually producing what we were told they would. And this notification is not coming from the Society of Petroleum Engineers or the Society of Petroleum Evaluation Engineers. It's coming from Wall Street. Back in January, the Wall Street Journal published an article, Fracking Secret Problems, Oil Wells Aren't Producing as Much as Forecast. Analysis reveals thousands of locations are yielding less than their owners projected to investors. And that's not the only one. Bottom line is, E&P's unconventional report card from Wall Street's not looking too good right now. Here's one that was published just earlier this month. Makes some very interesting observations. First, that since 2012, lateral lengths have increased 44% to where the average lateral length of a horizontal well is now approaching 1.5 miles. The volume of water, and I'm going to talk particularly about that in a minute, but the volume of water used to frac horizontals has increased 250%. And in 2018, we spent $70 billion to drill just under 10,000 wells. There's some neat rule of thumbs you can capture there. First of all, our average total well cost is $7 million a pop. And secondly, you could say that when you look at your Baker Hughes rig count, which ran in the 970s, 980s typically through 2018, you can pretty well estimate that each active rig is going to drill 10 wells a year, and you'll get to your total well count. And I'm talking about domestic U.S. My question is, how many of those wells are never going to pay out? That's the number I've never heard. How many of the horizontal wells that are being drilled today will never pay out? Let's do some back of the envelope calculations with what we just learned. Let's say that the rig count's going to continue to decline, and we're only going to have 900 rigs running. Well, they drill their 10 wells, so we're going to have 9,000 wells at $7 million a pop. We're going to spend $63 billion a year in drilling horizontals. Well, if our frac costs are half of that, then we're going to spend $32 billion to frac wells. I would purport to you that at least half of that is wasted because we have no directional or dimensional control of our fracs. We're going to waste $16 billion. What if there's a technology that could recover maybe up to half of that and put it back to work? You're talking about $8 to $10 billion a year. That's 1/8 of your AFE. Folks, I don't know why we're working so hard to redesign PDC bits again to maybe shave another half day off our drilling time, when the big money in play on our AFEs is our wasted frac costs. Lateral lengths are getting longer and longer. And just the Permian, for example, from 2010 to 2018, the longest lateral length went from 8,000 to 15,500. And the average lateral length doubled from 4,000 feet to 8,000. And even more recently, there's been a near 18,000 foot lateral drill. That's 3.4 miles of lateral. And if you look at this graph, you see how the lateral lengths over 10,000 feet in just the Permian have mushroomed. If we're losing a nickel a bale, maybe the answer is not to haul more hay. Back when Mr. Nickel and I started our engineering careers, this was our job. We're told to call what Dr. Ron Evans taught me was a penny-shaped frac in a conventional pay zone. We hope that the stresses above us and below us were higher, that we had stress contrast, and hopefully we end up with something like this. This is another George King depiction. Notice I have to get out this far with my hydraulic fluid to be able to get a prop length this far and to end up with this productive length. And yes, I'm going out of zone, but just some very small multiples of my pay thickness. And even if it's 2 or 3 times pay thickness, what we consider that is the cost of doing business, right? I had to create my hydraulic length out to here to get my prop length out to here to get my productive length out to here. So even though everything's not in the pay, everything pretty much is working for me. Wow, this is a hair-triggered deal. I think perhaps because in the shales, we got our education over here in the Barnett, and it is very complex. What I think you're seeing today is instead of a direct correlation to fracture complexity with brittleness, we're really gravitating more back toward that simple fracture model in a lot of our work today. This is a train wreck when it comes to frac control. This is the Wolf Camp. And the Permian has 45% maybe of the rig count, and the Wolf Camp has most of that. This is a model from our proprietary study done by Dr. Mike Smith at NSI Technologies. This is a model of a Wolf Camp frac from an actual frac. And what I tasked him with was this. I said, Mike, I want you to give me actual fracs that you've done in horizontal shale wells where you had all the data and you know that your model has nailed it. You're thoroughly confident in your model. Well, this is what he showed me for Wolf Camp. You get out to 400 feet, but if you look at your proppant concentrations here, they're pretty poor. And you have very poor connectivity to the wellbore itself. The reason is almost all your proppant, all your fluid, all your hydraulic horsepower went up out of zone. This shouldn't come as a shock. Microseismic data from the Wolf Camp, this is from SM Energy, they're showing that they often go almost up to 1,500 feet up out of zone. You've probably seen presentations like this called wine racks, where it's a profile view of the reservoir and you see the placement plan for horizontal laterals. Look at the fracture half lengths they're anticipating when they put these together. Heck, we've got a 300-foot jetting hose in our tool, and it's longer than 3 out of 4 of these. I mean, that's why well spacing is so tight, is because frac propagation is so short. Well, next, the problem of frac control is a dam problem. But you see I left the N off because there's Eufaula Dam. Why I put a picture of Lake Eufaula up there is because earlier this year, Rystad Energy released a report that for the next 3 years, for 2019 through 2021, we are going to use, to frac wells, we're going to use 16.9 billion barrels. I first saw that and I thought, well, that's a big number. How big is that? Well, it's within 1 billion barrels of the entire contents of Lake Eufaula. That's a lot of water. You know, I'm not so much worried about methane emissions shutting this thing down, but this concerns me. We have got to make more efficient use of our frac water. Next, it's a draining problem. This is a chart I started keeping a year or so ago of the total number of papers, and the cover of the JPT for last month tells it all. But this graph shows the total number of papers, technical papers only, published that deal with the topic of frac hits. The first paper to address it was done in 2012. Notice it took 5.6 years for the first 100 papers. It took only 8 months for the last 100. For the last couple of years, we've been generating a technical paper on frac hits at a rate of 1 per every 1.8 days. I'll bet you a steak dinner that by the time the Your Tech conference and the other conferences, a couple of which I've attended this year, they get their papers up there in that count, it'll be like a vitamin. It'll be one a day. By the way, I've been to 2 conferences, SPE's Hydraulic Fracturing Conference in February. And last month I was asked to speak at the Refrac Wells Conference. And I probably sat through at least 24 presentations on frac hits. There was not one reference that I can recollect where the hit target was a vertical well. Well, I'm saying it's a deck problem. What do I mean by that? Basically this. You've got to reshuffle the in situ stress deck contiguously for a significant distance if we're going to solve this problem. Because at its essence, it's an in situ stress problem. It demands an in situ stress solution. And I think it requires a paradigm shift. And I certainly agree with Daniel Yergin's quote up here about the contributions of Mr. Mitchell. And don't get me wrong, I'm not worried to carry the man's gym bag. But what I'm saying is, I think our industry needs that type of, that genre of paradigm shift if we're going to have any kind of frac control. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this video, but what I was going to show you here in the middle, this jetting tool blasts through that rock at a rate of just under 12 feet per minute. The power, the raw power we can harness with radiohydraulic jetting is incredible. Our target rate is just half that, 6 feet a minute. But this is where, back to our football analogy, we're saying we're playing offense here. In jetting pre-frac, ultra-deep perforations is what we call the mini-laterals, or UDPs. An inch and a half diameter, 100, 200, maybe 300 feet from the wellbore. That enables us to start fracking from the inside out. We can increase our exposure to the strong side of the reservoir. We start to at least influence, if not eliminate, frac hits. And here we're leveraging rock mechanics for optimum effectiveness. So this is what our wellbore would look like, our horizontal wellbore is, and this is a slice of it. But first, here in the red dashed lines, we hydraulically jet our ultra-deep perforation. Then we frac that stage. We move our tool system up the hole. We jet here. We set our packer so we're isolated from that first stage. And we frac down the coiled tubing casing annulus and frac that stage, and so on as we complete the well. This is where you might really think I was that guy on Highway 75. I'm not saying we need to do this a little bit. Here, for example, if you were to replace conventional perforations with UDPs to be able to control frac dimensions and direction, you need to jet generally 3 to 6 times, depending on what stage spacing you want. You need to jet 3 to 6 times the length of mini laterals as is the length of the wellbore lateral. So obviously you've got to have a system that can do this rapidly, reliably, and repeatably. Whoop. What's really interesting is the science of controlling frac geometry and direction is really being studied hard in China. These are just 4 papers that have been published within the last couple years about where they are looking at doing what I'm talking about, only they're looking at doing it from vertical well bores. This is what I think is the most important slide I'm going to show you. This is a line of equal stresses. Doesn't have dimensions on it, but what it's telling you is you're looking into the borehole, the mini lateral borehole that we've just jetted. That borehole is going to see really strong compressive forces on the sides. Because of that, it's going to see really strong tensile forces at the very top and the very bottom. This is in the situation where the greatest principal stress is in the vertical due to overburden. That's where we live, all right? Here, over on the left, you see where tunnels were hydraulically jetted in the column in a pillar support of an underground mine about 300 feet deep. The holes were jetted round. But look how they end up. They're oval because of what I just described over here. What's that look like in 3D? Well, when you jet a mini lateral borehole, you create weak points at the top and at the bottom. Now then, when you introduce your high pressure frac slurry, now the path of least resistance is to follow the longitudinal axis of that jetted borehole. You have created a new path of least resistance. Here's some results from Dr. Smith's study about what that would do in a Leonard shale frac. Up here is your original frac job. Notice all your proppant settles to the bottom. You barely have any wellbore connectivity at all. I'm changing that to a grayscale in this slide. And this is what you get. Now I've overlaid Dr. Smith's model of what would happen if you first jetted this UDP, this mini lateral borehole. Dang. There. And notice your frac length extends from 650 feet to 1,200 feet, almost double. What's even more significant is you stay in zone now. Your frac stays within the pay. And you get great proppant concentration along that lateral. You also have a lot of room to add even more proppant with the same amount of fluid if you wanted to. And that's what Dr. Smith's comment is there. What's also really interesting from Dr. Smith's modeling is that you now frac at a lot lower pressures. You'll need a lot less hydraulic horsepower on location, so now you get a smaller location to be able to frac. The bottom line is, whereas the Leonard is generally nowadays developed about 5 wells per section, you could reduce that to 3 to drain a section. Here's the beast, the wolf camp that we looked at earlier. And we do pretty well here too when we modeled a 2-inch UDP for this one. But we extend the frac length about 50%. And we have a lot better proppant placement than we had without it. So we're going to solve the dimensional problem by disrupting the in situ stresses. Our second phase tool, we hope to be able to contour the paths of our UDPs for whatever the rock's calling for. And we hope to be able to do this at a considerable distance. This is what Mike Smith said after all this was over. Bruce, this is how we should have been fracking wells all along. That is what makes an engineer drive against traffic. Back to our specific case. How are we going to protect the vertical well from frac hit? When we get to this stage where we know we're in hit territory, if you will, we're going to jet a UDP, just one, away from the parent well. Not only does this help protect the parent well, but it also exposes the producer to the strong side that he was never able to get to before when he was hitting your well. So that's a win-win solution. And the fact that somebody's going to have to pay me to implement it means it's a win-win-win solution. This is some patent pending stuff that my brother Brad did what I think some really excellent work on in putting together our own collar that mates up with our jetting assembly. What it allows us to do is to jet in either one or both directions, and then we can seal that lateral off. So think about this. You've drilled and cased your well. Instead of perforating, you call us out there, and we jet these laterals, and say we jet to the strong side, and we notice that that bottom hole pressure is a lot greater than the laterals we jetted to the weak side. What we're going to do is leave those strong side laterals open and producing before the frac crew ever arrives. We may do that for several months. And by doing that, we're further weakening the stresses around that mini lateral borehole and making it even more so the preferred path of least resistance. So what are we calling for? Instead of drilling 5 wells in the Leonard example, we say there needs to be a paradigm shift where we're drilling only 3 wells, call them super wells if you will. And look at this example. Here with 200-foot stage spacing, you drill 29 pairs or 58 UDPs. You jet a total of 17,400 feet of hole, so that's 3.3 times the length of your lateral. So you're going to need 48 hours at our targeted jetting time to do that. And that's just pure jetting time. Say it takes, instead of 2 days, it takes 3 or 4. And you spend $1 million to do it. Like I said, your surface location is smaller. You don't need a toe sleeve. You don't need wireline. There's a lot of costs over here to the right you're going to save on by using this system. But down here, the bottom line is you were going to spend, for 5 wells at $7 million each, you were going to spend $35 million. We're saying if you'll spend an extra $1 million or so per well, you only need 3. So you save, developing that section, $11 million, or about a 31% reduction in cost. Right now they're telling us in the unconventional world, our average finding cost is from $48 to $50 a barrel. With this technology and this math, we're saying you reduce that to 35 to 37 bucks a barrel. We think that is the stair-step improvement, the George Mitchell-like paradigm shift our industry needs to go to. Now I want to talk in these last few minutes about your wells, your vertical wells. How are we going to protect them? Well, if you went and sat through all the papers I had, you heard about how to protect horizontal wells. Everything from preloads to recharges to even refracturing the parent well simultaneously with the child well. One thing that I think is real important and that the technical literature's right on, you have got to have real-time pressure monitoring at your wells, and the operator has to know what that is while he's performing his frac job. The volumes of water that they're pumping in horizontal wells to try to prevent frac hits is nothing short of amazing. Preloads can go anywhere from 1,000 barrels to 20,000 barrels of water, all the way down to what they call a recharge, trying to recharge the reservoir. Devon's using 100,000 barrels of water in its horizontal wells to protect them. We talked to one engineer with a company I'll not name in the Permian, and that was doing this. And we asked him, is it working? And he said, we don't know. I'm thinking back to when I was an operator of vertical wells, and I'm nursing them along mostly on plunger lifts. My gosh, I would be scared to death to dump 100 barrels down one of mine. The cure could be worse than the disease, right? Here's what we're suggesting that you do. We're suggesting that you use diverters, and they're out there on the market now, that are used in diverting frac stages. Use those to temporarily plug your well. We're recommending, and we've submitted a patent application on this process, but that you start with what we call a reservoir diverter, something that gets out in the rock into your fracture system. Because you want to take as much of the pressure drop out in the formation as you can. Follow that with a wellbore diverter or something like TTS's perf pods, something that's going to plug you off at the perforation. Now, and you do all that with a minimum volume of fluid. Now you can load the hole. Now you can stand on it, right? Put positive pressure against it and protect your well. One product I want you to particularly pay attention for is a new product. This was just presented at the same Refrac Wells conference last month I presented at. But it's a product called InfuSeal, and it pumps as a liquid. And it's real interesting because when it stops, it sets up. If you shear it, it's no problem. You can move tools through it or whatever you need to do. But when it gets out in the rock and stops, it sets up. And they've tested it, and for several weeks in a row, it could withstand a 5,000 PSI pressure drop. The only thing I'm waiting to see on this is some retained permeability tests. Show me that this isn't going to damage the reservoir, because it breaks like those other diverters with wellbore temperature exposure over time. Show me when it breaks, it doesn't damage the rock, and I think you've got one-stop shopping with a product like this, where you can go in, protect out in the rock, put positive pressure on your well, and hold it all through the offset frac operation. Who's going to pay for this? And I'm not an attorney. I'm just an overeducated redneck is what my wife calls me. But why should you have to pay for this? Why doesn't the operator who's doing the fracking have to pay for these defensive mechanisms? And that's something I hope to learn more about through the rest of our presentation. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Conclusions: how do we stop frac hits? With direction. We use UDPs and we go in the opposite direction. With depletion, if necessary, we run Baby Brothers casing collars and we deplete those UDPs before we ever frac. One development I want you to watch closely for is for the development of real-time microseismic data. I think the day is coming very soon when an operator will be able to read microseismic and see those little dots marching toward your wellbore in real time and shut the pumps off before you're bashed. And lastly, you need to use the defensive tools of diverters to protect your well. And I know I started a little late and I've run a little late. Mike, am I good to ask for questions? Any questions? Yeah, before I take your question, did y'all want to give like a thunderous round of applause for... Yes, sir.
The fire diverters, how far do they go into your reservoir? Because essentially I'm not just trying to protect my wellbore, but also my reservoir is depleted, so it's a pressure sink, and that's why all the frac water floods towards my reservoir. Those fire diverters, how far does the protection actually go? Because if it just goes to my, protects my wellbore, then it's essentially like a flood, right? That I could say.
Yes. In general, and the thing about like BioVert, you can get it in various sieve sizes. I would think of it like you would proppant. If you want to pump it away at a higher pressure and open your frac widths up to put it in there, you certainly could. But I don't think you're going to get to a situation where you protect all of the reservoir in your drainage radius. What we had in mind is you're out there taking as much pressure drop as you can out away from the casing. Your wells aren't brand new, and I think the biggest concern ought to be casing integrity. Yes, sir.
How do you control the direction of your UDP once it's out to formation?
That's a great question because in theory, there's no mechanical interaction with the rock, right? Like with a bit that would kick it off crooked because you're hitting the target face straight ahead with a high-powered jet. So there's nothing mechanically to throw you off. We have patented a method and an apparatus that we will be able to steer the jetting hose and have real-time geospatial data transmitted from near the nozzle back to service to know what corrections we need to make. But it's all drawing board stuff right now to do that.
Right now, is it on some sort of flexible...
Yes. Mm-hmm. And the hose that my brother's going to be testing next month, that technology has just been out for a couple of years. We hope to be using a 3/4 inch ID jetting hose. I mean, you're starting to get to the dimensions of smaller size coiled tubing. And we will be able to put a lot of horsepower to the nozzle.
One
Yes, it's being done every day in vertical wells now. But I'll tell you what, I will get with you afterwards and I will bore you to tears. Anyone else?
Let's thank Bruce again. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.